Good evening. As always, I want to begin with our reform lines. We know how to behave based upon where we are on a reform line. About 4 months ago now, 4 or 5 months ago, there was a split began in this movement that everyone would have been safe from if they knew where we were on the reform line, what to expect. If we all had have agreed on that one point, where are we? What can we expect? There would have been no split in this movement. The split occurred because we did not have a common understanding of where we were at on the reform lines. If they had have seen where we were either on the line of the priests or on the line of the 144,000, there would have been no shaking. Everyone would have been safe. So I want to start these presentations with this claim. We are safe only as we know where we are on the reform line and how to behave. We were not safe prior to November 9. Elder Parminder has been covering this subject. Those that leave in the Sunday law history. We were in grave danger between August and November of last year. I want to make the claim we are in danger today. And people who do not understand where we are on the reform line, who don't trust in what those reform lines are telling us, are in the same degree of danger now as they were in August and September of last year. If we were to go back to the reform line of the 144,000, it begins in 1989. We are going to have an increase of knowledge in 1991. It will be formalized in 1996. And then we come to a test at 9/11. This is the first dispensation. This is the dispensation of the ploughing. The ploughing of the 144,000. We come down to this history. Sunday law, close of probation, second advent. And it's well established now, this repeating pattern. It's going to be an increase of knowledge that will be formalized at the loud cry. So that repeating pattern is well established. The ploughing history, the latter rain. We understand that repeating pattern also occurs in the early rain and the harvest. I won't try and draw this to scale with the line of the priests, because I want to be able to expand some dispensations. When it comes to the line of the priests, we have the same history of ploughing as the 144,000. We are ploughed from 1989 to 9/11. Early rain, from 9/11 to 2014. It's going to be another increase of knowledge. To 2009, the 2520, 2012 time setting. 2014 begins our latter rain. The reform line of the priests is just the same pattern fractalized of the 144,000. So we find our midnight cry in the history of our latter rain. There's an increase of knowledge to 16. It's formalized in 18. Shut door in 19. And now we are in the period of our harvest. From now until Panium. And we know that in this history there will be an increase of knowledge, which will be 2020, and it will be formalized. So this is the line of the 144,000. This is the line of the priests. From this point forward, they're not matching up, so don't try and... Don't try and place them over each other. I wanted to be able to expand the line of the priests. So when we take this line of really this whole history of the end of modern Israel, we compare and contrast it with the end of ancient Israel. And when we do that, we come to this history where we go to the world. And what waymark do we line that up with? This is 34 AD. They go to the Gentiles. I find this astonishing. That for the most part, all of Adventism has no concept of history prior to the Sunday law, of what leads to it. And yet the entire history of the Gospels and the first part of Acts are all about the history that leads to the Sunday law. It's all about God preparing Israel to go to the Gentiles. So we have been given a wealth of information to explain to us the time of the end to the Sunday law history. When we do this, we understand that it's to the world from 34 AD or the Sunday law. And prior to that, God is going to sort out Israel, ancient or modern, in 2 steps. First, the disciples, they come to their test, which is the cross. They've been trained under John, trained under Jesus, and then tested. The cross lines up in its primary sense with November 9, 2019. Repeating the point we began with, just understanding that alone, if we had have just agreed on that point alone, there could have been no split late last year. If they had have agreed, we must have an increase of knowledge on the Sunday law, and that the cross was this waymark. We're not going to go through the history of the end of ancient Israel today. But everyone knows how strong that is. If you've seen someone present that logic. That simple reform line alone should have prevented a shaking. We look at the history where the first angel passes the mantle to the second angel. We line up 9/11 with the baptism. So at the time of the end, the birth. Birth of who? Birth of John and birth of Jesus. You have both arriving at the same point in time. You have the first angel, John, do his work. You have the arrival of the second angel, Jesus, at his baptism. But he's not yet taking over leadership. He says his time has not yet come. He goes into the wilderness. Marriage of Cana. Marriage of Cana. And then first temple cleansing. Transitions from John to Christ. All prior to the cross. So I don't want to spend any more time on the line of Christ, other than to mark a couple of points, just to remind you. Both leaders exist at the time of the end. One is just going to stay in obscurity until it is his time. One is just going to stay in obscurity until it's his time. That's the first point. The second point is the transition from the first to the second. So you have both at the time of the end, then a transition, always at our middle way mark, from the first leader to the second leader. And the third point, just revision. The first angel, John. What's John's problem? John does not understand the nature of the kingdom. You have Jesus come, and does he understand the nature of the kingdom? Yes. And he's going to try and teach that through parable methodology. So Ellen White tells us that John has this problem. He doesn't understand the nature of the kingdom. And then you go particularly to Matthew 13, but through the Gospels. And Jesus repeatedly is saying to the disciples, the kingdom of heaven is like. In parable after parable, he's trying to teach them what John had wrong. When you get down to the history of Gethsemane and the cross, who is tested? The disciples. The movement is tested. Does that make sense? The Pharisees, they'd already rejected. It's the movement and those who claimed to believe that were there tested. And all those who failed that test had not been able to transition from the teaching of the first leader. So that's the 3 points I want us to remember. Both arrive at the time of the end. They transition at the first temple cleansing middle waymark. And the work of Jesus through parables is to help people learn what the first angel had wrong. Does Jesus understand the nature of the kingdom? Yes. In his message, does he make a mistake about the nature of the kingdom? Remember that point. Because people who do not understand our reform lines, do not put their faith in them, are starting to share the thoughts that in the history of our latter rain and harvest, this movement has all of these errors about the nature of the kingdom. There are complex arguments between FFA and ourselves. But just accepting the reform lines should have been enough for people. We're at the same position today. Just understanding that point alone. In April of last year, for the first time, Elder Jeff began to publicly attack the Midnight Cry message. But he didn't do it openly. He began by attacking the message of 2012. The conclusion of his study on 2012 would have undermined the Midnight Cry message. And his whole point was that the second angel is half right and half wrong. That Miller was half right and half wrong, Samuel Snow was half right and half wrong. He didn't go to the history of Christ. He didn't go to the history of Christ because he couldn't. So he went to 1888, 1844, 1888. And he said the second angel is half right and half wrong. In 1888, Wagner is half right and half wrong. He applied them to the second angel and said Elder Parminder is half right and half wrong. The conclusion of that is that both Elder Parminder and myself do not understand the nature of the kingdom. That was presented in April of last year, and we immediately put a stop to that study. We presented the logic that had already been part of the 2018 message. We went to the history of Pyrrhus, Macedonia, Italy. Then you have World War II. Then you have World War III. And we looked at the concluding scenes of these histories. We found that in our history, this war, we mark the end of it at Panium with a victory for the King of the North. When you go to World War II, it concluded in 1945 with a victory to the King of the South. In Italy, the victory was that of Rome, King of the North. In Macedonia, the King of the South. Prior to the victory of the King of the North at Panium, there are two prior battles, 2018 and 2019. Both of these are won by the King of the South. Prior to 1945, there's two battles. Both of these are won by the King of the North. Prior to the final battle in the history of Italy, Pyrrhic War, there are two battles won by the King of the South. Prior to the end of this Macedonian War, there are two battles won by the King of the North. So we were able to present quite firm logic and multiple witnesses. This is one. To show in Alpha and Omega histories. First history of Pyrrhus, second history of Pyrrhus. In the Alpha history, the King of the South wins. In the Omega, the King of the North wins. You can switch each battle of this history. So when looking at it from the perspective of the counterfeit, this counterfeit King of the North, and Alpha history is failure. The King of the North fails in an Alpha history and wins in an Omega history. We have two witnesses in this diagram. And then we also proved it from the line of of the beginning of modern Babylon. The papacy in the history of the world wars. Combined, that becomes 3 witnesses. That in an Alpha history, the king of the north fails, and in an Omega history, it is victorious. We recognized that when we come to 1844 and 1888, all of this is an Alpha history. 2 losses and then victory. 2 losses, and then when we get to the history of the 144,000, victory. Defeat, defeat, victory. Because this is all Omega. History of success. So, right back in April, we're presenting the logic that just as you cannot go to the history of World War II to see the King of the North complete its mission, you cannot go to the Alpha history of modern Israel, the true King of the North, and see the second angel complete its mission. Samuel Snow had mistakes. Wagner had mistakes. But that's because they're the Alpha history that's failure. You cannot drop a history of failure on top of a history of success. Without taking into account that modification. And it's the same with the true King of the North. We can't drop Millerite history straight into our own without making some modifications. And what makes the history successful is that the movement unlearns the mistakes of the first angel. That's the difference between failure and success. In the history of Christ, which is a history of success, it's an Omega history, John does not understand the nature of the kingdom. But then Jesus comes and he understands the nature of the kingdom. He's able to explain it. When you come to Millerite history, Alpha failure, Miller in his message does not understand the nature of the kingdom. Transitions to Snow. Does Snow fix those mistakes? No. He's expecting Christ's return on October 22, just like everyone else. So at the beginning they start the same. I want to note the beginning of these wars is the same. You don't start switching things at the beginning. Alpha or Omega, they all start with the exact same pattern. Then you get about halfway through and you have to switch. Whether it's the line of Moses, beginning of ancient Israel, end of ancient Israel, beginning of modern Israel, end of modern Israel. They all start with the same pattern. They start the same way.
bitandika mu ngeri emu.
The first angel is always mistaken about the nature of the
Nti
kingdom.
malayika asooka yatategeera bulungi ekikula ky'obwakabaka.
Moses, John, Miller, Jeff.
Nti Musa, Yokaana, Mira ne Odajeff.
They all misunderstand the nature of the kingdom.
Nti tebategeera bulungi ekikula ky'obwakabaka.
So those reform lines start with the same pattern.
So ne lifoomu ezitandika n'ekikula kye kimu oba enkola y'emu.
Then just like the king of the north,
Nga kabaka w'omumambuka
in its Alpha and Omega
mu byafaayo
histories,
ebitandika n'ebikomenkereza.
you come to the history of the second leader
Nti ojja mu byafaayo eby'omukulembeze owokubiri.
and you have to take into account that dynamic of success and failure, Alpha and Omega.
N'otandika okutegeera nti waliwo obuwanguzi n'okulemwa. Ku lugeri ebirabirawo okulemwa, omukomera ebirawo obuwanguzi.
So to repeat myself, if that was confusing,
Nti ageza okuba nga ateeza ekikibuzaabuza.
all of our 4 reform lines
Nti kufama yinza zaffe zonna
start the same way.
zitandika mu ngeri emu.
The first angel
Malayika asooka
does not understand the nature of the kingdom.
tategeera kikula ky'obwakabaka.
Moses thinks he needs to take it by force,
Nti Musa alowooza nti agenda akozesa amaanyi.
fighting. John thinks it's this earthly empire.
Yokaana alowooza obwakabaka bugenda kubeera obwakabaka obw'ensi.
Miller thinks that the earth is the sanctuary.
Mira alowooza nti ekifo ekitukuvu y'ensi.
We'll come to Elder Jeff.
Ne tutuuka ku mukadde Jeff.
But on 3 witnesses, you know that he also misunderstands the nature of the kingdom.
Obujulizi obw'emirundi Yesu butukakasa n'ekigenda okubeera ku Elder Jeff.
So our reform lines start the same,
So reform lines zaffe zitandika mu ngeri emu.
whether they're Alpha or Omega.
Newankubadde entandika oba enkomere.
Then we come to the arrival of the second leader.
Ne tutuuka ku kujja kwa omukulembeze owokubiri.
And in a history of success,
Nti mu byafaayo eby'obuwanguzi
the Omega,
ku ntandikwa
you find those mistakes corrected.
nga tulaba ensobi ezisooka kutereezebwa.
Jesus is able to correct their understanding.
Nti Yesu Kristo asobola okutereeza ensobi ezaaliwo.
He has the right message, a perfect message.
Nti alina obubaka obutuufu ate obubaka obutuukiridde.
If I can use the word perfect in that parabolic sense.
Nti ayinza okukozesa ekigambo ekituukidde mu kiseera.
Then you come to Miller.
Bw'otuuka ku Mira,
Samuel Snow corrects nothing.
Samuel so tena kyatereeza.
So it becomes a history of failure.
Bifuuka ebyafaayo ebyalimu.
Then we come to our history success.
Bw'etuuka ku byafaayo byaffe buwanguzi.
So just like the end of ancient Israel,
Nga bwe tulaba Isirayiri beekomenkereza ey'omubiri.
this second half of our reform line, from 2014 forward,
Okuva mu 2014 ogenda mu maaso,
we must see a correction of the mistakes of the first
tulina
messenger.
okulaba okugolola ensobi ezaaliyo emabega.
The reason I labour this point
Ensonga lwaki alina ku nsonga eno,
is so you have it embedded in your minds, refreshed.
wandi okuba nti ebirowoozo bizibwa bujja.
People are struggling in this movement
Abantu bafuba mu mugendo guno
about what the nature of the kingdom looks like.
nti obwakabaka ekikula ky'obwakabaka kikiri kitya.
And they're coming to the conclusions
Ne batuuka kumaliriza
that Elder Parminder and myself,
nti omukadde Pamela n'omukadde Tess
and all those who would want to sign their name onto this,
n'abamu abayinza okuba nga bagala kwetaba mu mulimu ogwo.
the nature of the kingdom that we've been teaching in the history of the Midnight Cry and into this time period of harvest
Ekikula ky'obwakabaka ekibadde kiyigizibwa okuva mu myogano ogenda mu maaso okutuuka ku kiseera eky'amakungula
is incorrect.
nti kikyamu.
That there was mistakes with Elder Jeff's model and with our model.
Nti waaliwo ensobi n'owooluganda Jeff n'enkola gye tukozesaamu.
And I want to warn those people,
Ayagala okuba nga alabula abantu abo
they're stepping away from our reform lines
nti nga bava ku reform lines zaffe
and beginning to use the exact same methodology as FFA.
nga baddamu ate okukozesa enkozesa methodi y'emu nga FFA gyekozesa
When they first started to leave this movement.
batandika okuba nga batandika okuva mu mugendo.
And if they follow along that same track of thinking, they will also leave this movement.
Era nabo bagenda kubeerawo batyo nga bava mu mugendo.
We must understand the nature of the kingdom.
Tugenda okuba nga tutegeeza ekikula ky'obwakabaka.
So I want to come back from that for a minute.
ayagala kukomawo
We've talked about our history,
togende ku byafaayo byaffe
this line of the priests.
erinnya abakabona
I want us to consider this line of the Millerites.
ayagala tugende nga tuneesigiri kulennya abaamira
Without drawing out the lines or proving it,
nga tukuba lini ey'okukakasa
we understand that October 22
tukirizaganya nti ogw'ekumi
is not the final close of probation of that history.
si okuggalirawo ddala okwa byonna okwebyafaayo ebyo
You can prove that
osobola okukakasa ekyo
because they go back to work in 1850.
kuba addayo mu 1850
If they're going back to work in 1850, they haven't closed their probation.
bwe baddayo okukola mu 1850 kitegeeza nti esi yali enkomerero ya byonna
They haven't reached Daniel 12:1.
kitegeeza baiti banakutuuka mu Danyeri 12 olusooka
So you understand that October 22
tokeza oba otegeera nti ogw'ekumi
is a shut door for a fractal.
nti lugirugalwawo naye ku layini entono
That shouldn't need proving, it should just make sense.
ekiteetagisa nakukikakasa kuba tekina kyaba nkikikola
They go to the world in 1850,
omulimu gugenda eri ensi mu 1850
so you know
manya
that October 22 is not Daniel 12:1 for that reform line.
22 ogw'ekumi si ye Danyeri 12 olusooka
Instead, it lines up with the test of the first group.
wabula kikwatagana ddala n'ekigezo ekisooka okugezesa gurupu esooka
They go through 1798,
nga batandika ddala mu 1798
their time of the end,
ate nga kiseera kyabwe ekyenkomerero
then they're going to go through the tarrying time.
bagenda mu kiseera ekyokulwa
We can mark April 1840, also April 19.
tuyinza okuba nga tukiteeka mu 18 ogwokuna 19
Then we can mark Boston,
tugenda e Boston
July 21st,
Julaayi 21
Concord,
tugenda e Concord
Exeter,
ne Exeter
and the primary application of October 22 is November 9 last year.
ate ntegeera esookerwaku eya gw'ekumi 22 ye Novemba
There's this first group
nti ekyo kigezo kya gurupu esooka
that are called out of the Protestant churches.
bayitibwa okuva mu makanisa ga Protestanti
They are trained under Miller.
bayigirizibwa wansi wa Mira
Then they are trained under Snow.
ne bayigirizibwa wansi wa Snow
They've been through a tarrying time.
ne bagenda mu kiseera ky'okulwa
And then they face October 22, the test.
October 22 nekibeera ekigezo kyabwe
That's one group of people.
ye gurupu esooka
October 22, they face their disappointment.
nti mu mwaka ogwo October 22 bafuna okusaalirwa
We know that they go back to work in 1850.
nti ne baddayo okukola mu 1850
So October 22 is a fractal.
so October 22 layini ntono
It's not the final close of probation for that time
naye
period.
si yenkomerero ya Danyeri 12 ku layini nene
I just want us to think a little about this history.
ayagala kufa tulowoozeemu ku nsonga y'ebyafaayo ebyo
You've had 1260 years of the Dark Ages.
tulina emyaka 26 ez'ekizikiza
Within that time period,
mu kiseera ekyo
you have the Protestant Reformation.
tulina gye tuyita okuzza obujja obw'abaprotestanti
What did God give to the Protestant Reformation to assist in their work?
kiki mukama kyawa abaprotestanti abazza bujja mu kiseera ekyo okuba nga kibayamba mu mulimu
He had a message it needed to spread. They had a message it needed to have a mechanism to share it.
nti okuba nga basobola bafuna obusobozi okugabana
What was that mechanism?
ngeri ki eyabaweebwa okusobola okuba nga bagabana obubaka
Sorry? The what? I'm talking about technology. The printing press.
nti babawa ekyuma
The Protestant Reformation begins. God is going to give them the printing press. Why? So they can take their message and transmit it to the people. This is in the history of the 1260. Then we come to the history of the Millerites. The Millerites have a message that needs to be transmitted to the people rapidly. So just like in the Protestant Reformation, God is going to give them mechanisms to transmit that message. What did God give them in this history? Press? It started in 1798 with gas. Gas that could now be used for lighting. We could go into a discussion of vaccines, but I want to keep this to what spreads the gospel. 1798 they have gas for lighting purposes. 10 years later, in 1808, they have steamboats. Boats that are now steam powered. In 1811, they're able to run printing presses off steam. But then of most interest, in 1825, passenger cars for trains. And for the first time, people could travel freely by train. Then in 1837, the telegraph. It's invented, but it spreads its first message in 1844. And the first message ever shared by telegraph says, "What hath God wrought?" What has God done? So from the end of the 1260, God has a message developing that needs to be spread rapidly to the world. Specifically in this history, to every corner of the United States. And people then traveled by wagon. It was all horsepower. So right just a few years before Miller needs to begin to publicly teach, you find the train system begin to be set up. By the time you get to 1844, if I was to read a couple of quotes by Joseph Bates, 1868, Joseph Bates. 'AJB 297.1. In 1847, BP 272.3. In this first quote, he's talking about the midnight cry of Exeter. He talks about the beginning of the Exeter camp meeting. He says, I was on my way there in the cars. You can go to other quotes to see how Miller used the train systems. Now Joseph Bates is travelling to Exeter on a train. And he has this thought, you're going to have new light at Exeter. He talks about the Exeter camp meeting. He said that the hills rang with the midnight cry. He says as the wagons, that would be drawn by horses, the stages, also horses, and the railroad cars rolled through all the different states. The cry resounded. The cry was spread. He says in the second quote that the message of the midnight cry flew as if it was on the wings of the wind. Men and women moving on all points of the compass, going with all the speed of locomotives, steamboats and rail cars, carrying books and papers, distributing them as the flying leaves of autumn. When it comes to the history of the midnight cry, it spread as on the wings of the wind because of the technology God raised up in that time period. Particularly the steamboats and the rail cars. That's what gave speed to the message. It's how Miller was able to travel and teach. It's how the midnight cry spread so quickly. And it's how Ellen White travelled in her history. This is what gave the Millerites the ability to rapidly spread the three angels' messages. So in the Protestant Reformation, God is going to give the printing press. In the history of the Millerites, He's going to give them the speed of travel. Passenger cars for trains and steamboats. Now I come from Australia. We don't have river systems. If we do, they're tiny and mostly dead. But for America that has these massive river systems, you're able to travel rapidly through those river systems on steamboats. So they're given these mechanisms to help them spread the message rapidly. Then we come down to our history of the 144,000. What are we given so we can spread the message rapidly? What begins to open up to us is the World Wide Web. Now we don't have to hop on a car and all of us travel to different parts of the compass. Now this can be uploaded tonight and watched in Australia immediately. So God has given a further increase in knowledge. But this isn't a knowledge of prophecy. He opens up the mechanics of how to spread the message. Now we have the World Wide Web, which harnesses the power of the internet. And then in 1996, so 1989 to 91, with the World Wide Web. 1996 is Google. Someone also mentioned some others, Wikipedia, etc. also fit in, but for now it's the World Wide Web, Google. We know Wikipedia, YouTube, they also developed in this time period. But this is what coincides with our increase of knowledge. Development, release of the World Wide Web, and then the release of Google. The problem with God giving these technological advancements is they are not kept just for His people. Anyone could print anything on that printing press. I'm sure the Catholic Church started to use them quite rapidly. They benefit all sides of the argument. It wasn't just Millerites travelling by train. That technology benefits everyone. And it's the same with the internet. But it's a subject of prophecy that God is going to open up an avenue for the spreading of this message. And we can identify that the key points in this journey coincide with our reform line. So if we were to come to the history of 1996, we find two information streams. CNN and Fox. Now I've spoken a lot about these information streams. Just like these other advancements in technology, any side can benefit from the World Wide Web. And very quickly, these two opposing sides harness that engine. You find that CNN, which tends to have a either mainstream or liberal bend, it will be transmitting news. So will this new form of media, Fox News. We all know what Fox News becomes. The propaganda machine of America's dictator. So these machines don't just benefit God's people. What I wanted us to consider is why we find them at the time of the end. Because we can tend to think that these media streams are all for the benefit of the world, the Nethinims. But 1996 is not anywhere near the line of the world. Instead, it's on our reform line. I will redraw. You have 1989, 9/11. In 1996, you have the formalization of the message. Internally, Time of the End magazine. And these two entities, CNN and Fox. You have 9/11. We won't be discussing the line of the Levites now. I want to just take us back to the line of the world. The line of the world begins in 2014. But right back in our reform line, there's a couple of people we need to pay attention to. We talk about Jerry Falwell. No, Elder Tabo's been covering these subjects. So you should be aware of these names. They won't need introduction, I'll just remind you of them. And he'll have added additional information to just a couple of bullet points I want to say. You have the moral majority from 1979 to 1989. This 10-year history. And Jerry Falwell. All taking us to the time of the end. Also in this history, you have the introduction of another personality, Michael Moore. He releases his first documentary in 1989 called Roger and Me. So Michael Moore begins to spread his message, fulfill his life calling in 1989. And then we've also spoken before about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Born October 13, 1989. So we have these three personalities and these two information streams. We mark Jerry Falwell apostate Protestantism, Michael Moore and AOC, his liberal opposition. I just want us to note all these people connect to the time of the end. For the 144,000. So you know that they're relevant for everyone who wishes to be part of the 144,000. They're not distant characters only relevant to the world or the Nethinims. It becomes part of your responsibility to know who they are and how you identify to them. What do they mean to you? So I won't discuss much of Jerry Falwell. I believe Elder Tabo would have covered some of his history. But we have these personalities, Michael Moore and AOC. We particularly began to discuss them in connection to our midnight cry. 29 years after they were introduced to our reform line. And we're going to connect them to the line of the world. But before we do that, I want us to have it clear in our minds. These people are relevant for the 144,000. And we have to know how to relate to them. So in our final minutes, I just want to recap. Because I know we've covered a few concepts. We did the line of the 144,000. There are 4 dispensations, 5 key waymarks. 1989, 9/11, Sunday Law, Close of Probation, Second Advent. We identified that the Sunday Law connects with 34 AD, the spreading of the message to the world. By this time, God has sorted out his church. Then we left that subject and went to this first group. I wanted us to relate it to both the Millerite reform line and the line of Christ. So we built its 4 dispensations: 1989, 9/11, 2014, 2019, 2021. As way of revision, we just touched on the history of Christ. Twice he goes to the church, Israel. Then once to the Gentiles. The first time he takes a group out of his church, they're known as the disciples. And they go through this history of training under the first and then the second messenger. At the end of the training from the second, they face the test of the cross. And to pass that test,
okuyita ekigezo ekyo
they have had to have learnt one important thing.
nti balina okuba nga waliwo ekyensonga kye baayiga.
They are not followers of the first,
si bagoberezi basooka,
they have become followers of the second.
bafuuse bagoberezi bawookubiri.
They have not learnt that,
nga tebayize ekyo kyokka,
they leave as did Judas
nti era balina kuvaamu nga yuda
before the cross.
ng'omusaalaba tegunnatuuka.
Just as Elder Parminder has discussed the Sunday law history,
Era nga bw'atyo eddepamina batulaze Sunday
the many that leave.
eri abangi abafuluma.
So the cross is the first time God reaches into Israel, pulls out a people.
nti gwe mulimu gw'okuswala ku musaalaba Kristo Mukama bajjamu abantu be.
He's going to do the same thing at Pentecost.
Kye kimu kyagenda okukola ku Pentekooti.
We wanted to remember three things.
Twagala kujjukira ebintu bisatu.
The first and the second messengers, leaders, arrive at the same point at the time of the end.
Omubaka asooka n'owokubiri batuuka mu kiseera kye kimu ate ekiseera eky'enkomerero.
You have the arrival of the second with the baptism,
Tulaba owokubiri ng'atandika atuuka ku kiseera ky'okubatizibwa.
but his time has not come to take over that ministry
Abagamba ekiseera tekirina bali kubanga atwala obukulembeze.
until after the baptism with the first temple cleansing.
Nti okubeerera ku kubatizibwa kutuuka ku yeekaalu okulongoosa omulundi ogwasooka.
He's going to teach through parables,
Agenda kuba ng'akwata engero.
and the point of what the disciples need to learn
Nti ensonga abayigirizwa kye beetaaga okuba nga bayiga,
is that while John plowed them, he trained them,
newankubadde Yokaana yakabala era ng'abatendeka,
the first messenger
omubaka asooka
does not understand the nature of the kingdom.
tategeera kikula ky'obwakabaka,
The second does,
nti ate owokubiri amanyi bulungi.
and they have to trust the second.
Era nga obwesige bwabwe baga nti okubuteeka ku bwokubiri.
John taught
Nti Yokaana ayigiriza
that this kingdom was an earthly empire.
nti obwakabaka buno bwali bwakabaka obw'okuteekebwawo ku nsi.
Judas died
Nti Yuda afa
because he believed John's message over Christ.
kubanga yakkiriza obubaka bwa Yokaana nga bwe yali ayogera ku Kristo.
That's where he failed.
Awo we yagwira.
Some of the disciples may have been confused.
Nti abamu ku bayigiriza bayinza okuba nga batabuddwa.
There were things that came as a shock to them,
Nga waliwo ekintu kyajja nga kyewuunyisa gye bali.
but Ellen White tells us
Anyway, kyakugamba
that at the cross,
nti ku musalaba
they loved Jesus more than they ever had before.
nti baagala Kristo okusinga buli kimu yali amwagadde.
Their loyalty on that level could not be shaken.
Nti era okwagala okukola ebiteddamu kuliva kuyigirizibwa.
So the two leaders both exist from the time of the end.
Obukulembeze bonna babeera ku kiseera ky'enkomerero.
The second arrives,
Owokubiri atuuka,
then the second takes over,
n'owokubiri n'akwata obuyinza,
then the second
naye owokubiri
is going to teach them the pure, true nature of the kingdom.
agenda kubayigiriza tekitukutegeeza kyenyini amazima obwakabaka bwa Katonda kye buli.
Then they're tested
Naye ne bagezesebwa
based on whether or not they've understood and accepted that
nga
message
basinzira oba bategeedde oba tebategeedde kibadde kiyigirizibwa.
at the shut door of the cross.
Era kati tulaba obujuligalwa ku musalaba.
We spoke about the difference between a history of failure and a history of success.
Twogedde ku ebyafaayo eby'oluwangu n'ebyafaayo ebiremwa.
In April last year,
Nti mu mwezi ogwokuna omwaka oguwedde,
Elder Jeff is going to make his first open attack on the message.
nti owooluganda Jeff agenda kuggulawo olutalo ku bubaka.
And he does it nicely,
Nti takikola bulungi,
but the consequences of what he was attempting to share was serious.
nti ekyo ekyavamu ekyo yali agezaako okuba nga agabana n'abantu kyavaamu obuzibu bw'amaanyi.
So we responded politely, I believe,
Ne tuddamu n'obwetwazi obukakamu,
but firmly.
naye ate nga tuli bakakafu.
We had to say openly for the first time
Baali baakuvaayo mu lwatu omulundi ogusookera ddala
that his message was dangerously incorrect.
nti obubaka bwe bwali bwa butwa ate nga bukyamu.
This was in April of 2019.
Kino kyaliwo omwaka oguyise mwezi ogwokuna.
The message of October 2018
Nti obubaka obwa omwezi ogw'ekkumi 2018
had given us two Alpha and Omega histories.
nti batuwa ebyafaayo ebitandiika n'ebyafaayo ebikomenkereza bya mirundi ebiri.
Pyrrhus in an Alpha and Pyrrhus in an Omega history.
Nti Peerasi mu byafaayo ebitandiika ne Peerasi mu byafaayo ebikomenkereza.
We had a second witness,
Kino obujuli obwokubiri,
World War II and what we already knew of World War III. And we were able to understand through this study that while the reform line begins the same, at the time of the end when you see the King of the North and the King of the South, you don't have to make switches. It's all consistent. But then when you get to these three final battles, there's a difference between failure and success. Right from the history of when we would mark the midnight cry. And you find that in a history of failure, this alpha history, this counterfeit King of the North fails. And in Omega history, this counterfeit King of the North is successful. So just as we have these two Alpha and Omega histories, failure, success, we're understanding around this time period that Christ should have come back in 1863. So why didn't he? Didn't because it's an Alpha history and the Millerites failed. There's failure for the King of the North here, for God's kingdom. In their Alpha they also failed. So Christ could not have come back. Not in the history after 1844. Not in the history after 1888. Just like this Omega history of the King of the North. Even here you can mark failure, success. So if you want to just take this as one line of Adventism. Adventism from 1798 to the Second Advent. You still find failure, success. And when you make that change from a history of failure to a history of success, as evidenced by Christ, with three other witnesses. This witness, the counterfeit of the papacy, the history of Christ. 4 witnesses that all demonstrate that in the time period of the second messenger, they understand correctly the nature of the kingdom. They're not going to have a prophetic disappointment because there is not a mistake in that message. So Elder Jeff attacked that. I said at the very beginning, we were in a time period of danger before November 9. It's Gethsemane and the cross. We're in a time period of danger today. We're in the wilderness of temptation. So just as we were in danger before November 9, you can't take your eyes off the lions. We're in danger now. No one needed to leave the movement last year. No one would have left the movement last year if they had any faith in that basic reform line and in the midnight cry which taught a history of success. And people today are struggling with the same concepts that Elder Jeff shared. They would not side with him. They would not take his side. But they don't realize they're using his exact same logic, which is divorced from reform lines and attempting to teach that there are mistakes in the history of the second angel in a line of success. That's where Elder Jeff began, and we all know where he ended. So I want to send a warning to those people. Meant in love. Meant in love. You're using the same methodology. You're distrusting the lines. You're refusing to trust them. And buying into the same arguments Elder Jeff made when he began to separate himself from this movement. You might do it over different doctrines, but you're following the exact same path. And if everyone can see just what was taught last April, difference between a history of failure and a history of success, we can have the beginning of surety of where we are, what we need to understand. So we'll come back in the morning. We want to consider where we are on some other reform lines. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you, Lord, that you do not leave us having to doubt. We know where we are. Lord, you have given us abundant proof of the truthfulness of this movement. Father, every one of us could fall away, could leave, and yet this movement will go on to success, with or without us. I pray for every head bowed, Lord, that it will be with us. For our brethren that are struggling with these messages, that are distrusting the lines, following a different creed, I pray, Lord, that they will see their danger in time, that they will realize that we mean only love, that we do not want to be separated from them as we have been from other brethren that we also love over these last months. Father, we do not desire this shaking, but we know that this movement can only be successful as we keep to the truth. We can only be part of that success as we individually keep to the truth. I pray, Lord, that you be with us, strengthen us in your faith. In Jesus' name, amen.